Hello everybody, it's Skaaro the Red again, and welcome to another Sunday night story time where we will continue the ridiculous Ballad of Skaaro the Red, and tonight we'll be doing chapter 7, and while we read the chapter, we're going to do a little bit of running around here in Port Nyanzaru. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. As Skaaro drifted away from the burning wreckage of the Golden Falcon, sitting on a broken plank of wood, he pondered once more if this was another of the aboleth's bizarre nightmares. What could drive that creature to delight in such madness? Then, something small softly whistled down from the sky. Splsh! The small object fell into the water right beside Skaaro. For a brief moment, Skaaro tried to convince himself he didn't care what it was, but curiosity overcame him, and Skaaro dove into the water to retrieve the sinking object. Although it was dark underwater, Skaaro was able to see well enough to reach out and grasp the object. When his hand grasped it, he felt a mass of wet hair within his fingers. Immediately repulsed, Skaaro released the object. But again his curiosity got the best of him, and he dove a bit deeper to retrieve the hairy object. Grasping it again, Skaaro swam back to the surface, slung the wet hairy object onto his little floating board, then climbed back on. As soon as Skaaro was back seated upon the floating board, he immediately realized the object was in fact a human head. The head was covered in long, black hair and was still oozing blood from the bottom where it was cleanly sliced at the neck. Although the face was downturned, Skaaro immediately suspected he knew whose head he had just recovered. Tentatively, Skaaro lifted the head with disgust and slowly turned it over to see Toothless Pete's face. A twisted expression of surprise etched into his face. Horrified, Skaaro dropped the head, turning face down again. With a deep breath, Skaaro slowly turned the head around again and tried to close poor Toothless Pete's eyes. But due to the rigor mortis, Pete's eyes simply wouldn't stay shut. At first, the idea of gouging them out with his dagger crossed his mind, but then he figured the aboleth might enjoy that sort of thing, so he simply tore a piece of his pant leg and wrapped it around Toothless Pete's head. Although he probably should have, Skaaro simply could not bring himself to toss poor Toothless Pete's head back into the sea, so he decided to keep the head and give it a nice proper burial at the first opportunity. And even though Toothless Pete was nothing more than a disembodied head, it still provided a strange sense of company. After several days of drifting at sea, Skaaro sat on his little floating board and thought aloud, "I wonder how far we are from those Neverwinter Isles that our Volo fellow talked about." Looking down at Toothless Pete's head, as though expecting an answer, Skaaro began to wonder if he was simply thinking aloud or talking to a disembodied head. Skaaro nonetheless continued, "Based on the direction of the rising and setting of sun, we seem to be drifting southwards." He unwrapped Toothless Pete's head, revealing the same shocked expression, accompanied by a rather pungent odor. Skaaro inadvertently reacted to the foul smell and dropped Pete's head. Skaaro attempted to grasp at it, but it rolled away, just out of reach and off the edge of the board, back into the sea. "Petey!" Skaaro dove into the water after it. At first he couldn't see it anywhere. Then, just below, he spotted it, and it was sinking fast. Skaaro swam down as fast as he could, and quickly caught up with the sinking head. Grasping hold of Toothless Pete's hair, Skaaro swam back to the surface, and climbed back aboard his little boat. "That was a close one," he said to Toothless Pete's severed head. "We better make sure that doesn't happen again." Skaaro used his little dagger to pry and break off a piece of thin stick from the edge of his little board, and sharpened one end of it. He then used his dagger to gouge a small hole in the deck of his floating board. Then, with a terrible crunching, squishing noise, Skaaro impaled Toothless Pete's head onto the sharpened stick, and slid the blunt end into the hole he had made in his floating board. With Toothless Pete's head now securely mounted, Skaaro looked at it with pride, and asked, "Isn't that better now, Pete?" After a moment of silence, Scarl stated, as though responding to the head, "Okay, well, maybe having a spike driven through your skull isn't exactly ideal, but at least you won't be rolling overboard again. You don't want to end up as fish food, do ya?" Scarl continues to drift for many days and nights until one morning he is awakened to the sound of a squawking bird. He opens his eyes to see a bright green and purple parrot perched upon Toothless Pete's head, pecking at his eyeball. "Shoo now, you feathery scavenger," Scarl said, swatting at the parrot, but before it took off, the parrot yanked one of Toothless Pete's eyes right from its socket and flew away. "Damn it," Scarl cursed. "Don't worry, Petey," Scarl said. "We'll get you a new eye, and then we'll make those damn parrots pay dearly." As Scarl glared at the bird flying into the distance, he spotted a small island. "Yeah, ha ha, land ho!" he shouted at Toothless Pete's head. "That must be one of those islands Orvalo told us about." Scarl furiously paddled the little floating board towards the island. Progress was slow, so Scarl jumped into the water and swam behind the board, pushing it forward. After about an hour of paddling and kicking, Scarl finally arrived at the island. Once he reached shallow enough water, he removed Pete's head, still on its stick, and abandoned his little floating board and walked up to the beach. The beach was covered in sparkling white sand, and just beyond the beach, a line of palm trees bordered a thick jungle. Rising above the jungle, a single small mountain could be seen in the distance. Scarl walked along the beach for a short time, looking for any signs of life or civilization. After walking only a few minutes, Scarl came upon a small dinghy boat. Pointing at the dinghy and holding up Toothless Pete's head stick, Scarl looked at it and said, "Hey, Pete, that looks like one of the dinghies from the Golden Falcon. You don't suppose there may have been survivors?" Scarl ran up to the little dinghy for a closer inspection. When he got closer, Scarl noticed countless little footprints in the ground around the dinghy. Suddenly, several birds abruptly flew out of the jungle, and a sense of unease came over Scarl. Slowly scanning the edge of the jungle, Scarl watched carefully for any movements. Then, he felt a sharp sting in his neck. Feeling it with his hand, he found a small feathered dart embedded in his neck. Plucking the dart out, Scarl tried to examine it, but his vision was becoming blurry and he felt dizzy. Scarl fought the effects of the dart and roared at the dark jungle. "Come out and face me, you cowardly..." Then a second and third dart stung him in his arm and belly. "You'll have to do better than..." Then again he was stung by a fourth and fifth dart. Groggy, but still on his feet, Scarl's vision blurred into darkness, and finally, after several more darts, Scarl succumbed to the effects of the toxin and tumbled into the sand. Scarl woke sometime later in a small wooden cage, inside a tent of some kind, with a terrible headache. As Scarl began to sit up, he heard a voice. "Oh, am I glad to see you!" Turning his head, he saw Orvalo, who was also locked in another wooden cage next to his own. As his vision cleared, Scarl noticed Orvalo had been partially dismembered. His left arm and right leg had been completely removed, and half of his left leg was also missing. The stumps were wrapped in large, blood-soaked leaves. Orvalo waved at him with his remaining hand. "Where in the Nine Hells are we?" Scarl asked. "And what in Moradin's name has happened to you?" Orvalo cast him a serious look and said, "We are on an uncharted island, very near the Nolanthra Isles, but..." He paused for a moment. "It would seem we have been captured by a tribe of wild gully dwarfs." Then Orvalo leaned over and tilted his head slightly. "What's that you got there on the floor beside you?" Scarl looked down to see Toothless Pete's impaled head on a stick in the cage beside him. With a huge grin, Scarl snatched up Pete's head and hugged it for a moment. Then, proudly presenting it to Orvalo, he stated, "Why, it's none other than Toothless Pete!" Orvalo looked absolutely mortified at the sight of Toothless Pete's partially rotten head, and he immediately puked on himself out of sheer repulsion. "What in the stars is wrong with you? That's just bloody wrong! I don't even know who I should fear most, these cannibal dwarves or you!" Scarl looked at him inquisitively. "Wait, did you say cannibal dwarfs?" "Aye," Orvalo responded. "What do you think happened to my legs and arm?" he stated while waving what was left of his severed limbs.
Look, Orvalo continued, when I escaped the Golden Falcon, I took a wee bit of the treasure with me, and I managed to hide it before I was captured by these damn gully dwarves. If you can get us out of here, I'll take you to the treasure. We'll split it 50-50, huh?
Skaaro cast him a serious glare.
I'll help ya, he responded, but I want all of it. Fine, said Orvalo. Just get us out of here, please.
Skaaro simply stood up, shattering the rickety wooden cage around him with ease. Chuckling, Skaaro kicked open the door to Orvalo's cage and pulled him out. Grabbing Orvalo by the good arm and slinging him onto his back, Skaaro started towards the door. But before he reached it, the flap flung open and a filthy mud-covered gully dwarf appeared, carrying a primitive spear and wearing nothing but an oversized and strangely decorated mask. Upon seeing Skaaro carrying Orvalo on his back, the gully dwarf started a panicked shouting in an unintelligible language. Before he could level his spear at them, Skaaro charged through the little dwarf, trampling him to the ground. Outside the tent, a swarm of the wild gully dwarves surrounded them, pointing spears at them and fervently shouting in their strange language. Holding the dismembered Orvalo by the wrist with one hand and wielding Toothless Pete's head on a stick with the other, Skaaro roared with all his might and swung Orvalo around himself, breaking several of the spears around them. Skaaro tossed Orvalo into a group of tribal dwarves as they approached, knocking them to the ground. Then, leaping onto another of the oncoming dwarves, Skaaro toppled him to the ground and stabbed the bottom of Toothless Pete's headstick into the dwarf's eye socket, straight through his wooden mask, through his head, and impaled him to the ground. As Skaaro rose to his feet, he picked up two of the broken spear tips and, wielding one in each hand, said, "Come fight me," Skaaro demanded, beckoning the remaining dwarves. Many of the tribal gully dwarves still kept their spears pointed, but were now fearful of Skaaro and kept their distance. Then, suddenly, one of the largest of the gully dwarf tribe stepped forward. This one was heavy set, and in addition to his brightly painted war mask, he also wore a colorful feathered headdress and wielded a metal short sword.
"Why, that's my sword," Orvalo said.
"Ooka dooka gum gum,"
he said in a loud voice, thumping his chest. He pulled the war mask from one of the fallen dwarves and wielded it as a shield. Then he drew his sword and challenged Skaaro. This one must be their chief, Skaaro thought to himself. As the chief gully dwarf approached, Skaaro quickly flung the two broken spear tips at him, but the chief blocked them with his makeshift mask shield. Before the chief could lower his shield, Skaaro was already charging at him. Reaching into his beard, Skaaro drew his little hidden dagger, and lunging at the chief, stabbed him in the belly. The chief dwarf pushed Skaaro away with his shield and slashed at him with his sword. Skaaro rolled away, dodging the sword slice, but the chief managed to follow up with a swift kick, catching Skaaro in the abdomen and causing him to stumble back. Then the chief again tried to slash at Skaaro with his sword, but this time Skaaro ducked below the blade and charged forward, toppling the chief to the ground. The chief's sword flew from his hand, and Skaaro mounted the prone body, preventing him from standing back up. Skaaro then proceeded to deliver a flurry of punches to the chief's face, shattering his mask and battering his face. The chief tried to raise his makeshift shield to cover his face, but Skaaro snatched it away and tossed it aside with ease. Skaaro continued to deliver continuous blows to the chief's face, and his head began to crack and break beneath the might of Skaaro's rage. He continued to hammer the chief's head until it completely shattered with a crunchy, squishing sound. Then, nothing remained but a pile of mush and broken skull. The tribe of gully dwarves broke into a cacophony of shouting and yelling at the sight of their chief slaughtered before them. Seated upon the chest of the dead chieftain, Skaaro looked around to see all the gully dwarves jumping around. Then, a very strange-looking dwarf emerged from the crowd. Rather than a painted wooden mask, this one wore a feathered skull and dozens of necklaces covered in various bones. He carried a staff with what appeared to be a snake coiled around it and a human head atop it. Before Skaaro could stand up, several more darts stung his body, and then the strangely dressed gully dwarf approached him and blew a cloud of sparkling purple dust into his face. As Skaaro watched the twinkling dust surround his head, darkness set in, and he immediately drifted out of consciousness.
And that's all for Chapter 7 of the ridiculous Ballad of Skaaro Red.
I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in for watching and enjoying the show. We'll be back every Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time with more of Skaaro's Ballad here. If you enjoy the show, give me a thumbs up, a like, upvote, subscribe to my channels. I have a YouTube channel. You can catch me on Twitch, as I said, every Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And that's on twitch.tv/ScaaroTheRed. And once again, thank you everyone for watching. And I look forward to seeing you next week.